By popular demand, it is finally here, folks. I received not one, but 3 comments asking me to make the ghost hunting industrial complex video I promised about a month ago, and it's here. And so I've taken the liberty of just spookifying the setup a little bit. We've got Chad over here, we've got some candles, some ambient lighting, we've saged the space, we're feeling good. This is a D's Nuts candle, not my purchase, but we're rolling with it. I am so excited to unpack this topic, and also so excited for you in the comments to tell me all of your ghost stories, because I, for one, am always here for a good spook. So this video is going to focus specifically on the rise of either network television and online content surrounding ghost hunting shows. So although ghost hunting and just fascination with the occult and ghosts have existed long before the early 2000s, we are going to be sticking to this very specific and wonderful group of shows because there was simply too much to unpack. The human relationship with the paranormal spans across centuries and almost all cultures. The thought that there's something beyond death that we just haven't figured out and how it interacts with us in our living world. Now, I was raised in a family that was all about the supernatural, the cryptoids, the ghosts, the UFOs, all of it. One of my first memories of my grandfather was him telling me a story about Vietnam when we were at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. I was 6 years old. And the story he chose to tell me was this one. When he was in Hawaii, him and a group of other men observed a huge flash in the sky that just suddenly disappeared, and he believes that it was some sort of alien UFO. We also grew up in the Christian church. My mom's Catholicism and my dad's baptism never really blended to give an explicit definition of what the supernatural was, at least to me anyways. But regardless, a not insignificant portion of my childhood was thinking about death, my life's purpose, and where people go after they die, and whether I was going to hell. Can I get a kumbaya? But really my exposure to the supernatural came from my mom and the things that interested her in the shows that she would always have on. She was my grandfather's daughter, so of course she grew up looking for Bigfoot on camping trips, having an interest in spooky stories. And she raised my sister and I on the classics. I'm talking everything that's sci-fi, the Travel Channel, Destination America, Discovery, ID had to offer. In our house, the TV is pretty much always on, even if there's no one around to watch. So chances are, if you walk past my mother's TV right now, it'll be playing something like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Hunters International, Ghost Adventures, The Haunted Collector, Long Island Medium, Expedition Unknown. She really likes that Josh Gates. A haunting, and then like any other number of like Bigfoot, cryptid, ghostly show you can think of, and if it's not that, it's the graphic story of a woman being murdered on Dateline. There is no in between. And little did I know in the early 2000s that I was experiencing what was the golden era of paranormal television. What had once been limited to campfire stories or worse, books, could now be captured and broadcasted to a much wider audience. The early 2000s boom of reality TV, the novelty of various ghost detecting technology, and America's complicated relationship with the spirit world made it a perfect market for ghost hunting television. Although Unsolved Mysteries and In Search Of are perhaps earlier examples, those aired in the 1990s, I would say the genre didn't really come into its own until the air of the one, the only Ghost Hunters in 2004. Now, some theorists tie this fascination with ghosts in the early 2000s to 9/11. I think that's a perfectly valid theory, but as someone who pretty much was born with no memory of what it was like before 9/11, I feel like I have no ability to weigh how much that really is true, if that makes sense. But what I do know is that Ghost Hunters was an immediate success, and ghost hunting shows generally is just a bunch of dudes walking around with a few cameras going, "Huh, huh," like for 20 to 30 minutes every week. It's a very low budget thing, so it was very easy for a bunch of shows to replicate and try and cash in on the hype. Unlike a sitcom or a teen drama, you don't have to hire at least as many writers or producers. The sets are all built for you, and each episode can follow the exact same format with no real resolution at the end, and the audience won't care. It's honestly not even necessary to have good lighting or audio in these shows, because part of what enhances these spooks is that they're running around in the dark with EVPs that sound like they came from a toaster. Ghost Hunters was probably the show my mom watched the most, so I guess she was really into Jason, I don't know. The program featured Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson, who founded the Atlantic Paranormal Society, or TAPS. And this was a team of paranormal investigators that would typically, on request, investigate to see whether a place was haunted and what evidence they could collect. I don't know how long into the making of the show that the two supposedly worked as plumbers during the day, and this was just like their side hustle, I guess. They were really girl bossing it up back in the day. The show has since run for 14 seasons since 2004 and has had multiple spin-offs and knockoffs since. It is very much the blueprint, the gold standard of this genre. When investigating a location, TAP's team members first visit and survey the property with its owners, who describe their experiences at the site, any spooky things that have happened to them, anything to look out for, any ghosts with a lust for human flesh. And then next, we always get a montage of them setting up the electronic equipment in what they believe will be paranormal hotspots, where things are the spookiest. And then the team will spend several hours taking electromagnetic and temperature readings, recording audio for EVPs, and then it'll either be shot in the classic green night vision or in black and white. Afterwards, the team will analyze the data and sort of talk through it with each other. And at the end of the scene, Hawes and Wilson will go back to the location owners and show them what they found. And at this point, they're supposed to sort of give advice on what to do at that point in the situation. But the majority of what is shown on the show is really just them either validating or invalidating the homeowner's experience, depending on what they found. There's never really any talks about like how specifically to interact with the ghosts, or if you need to remove them, or how you would go about doing that. And like you'll get a 30-second, like 6-week update being like, oh, all their problems are solved. But there's never really like a finite resolution with any of these shows. And it's also important to point out that overwhelmingly, the ghost experience that the ghost hunters and the owners are talking about on these shows is negative. There are no Caspers out here in this universe. The next show that solidified the genre for me and my personal favorite was the classic Ghost Adventures.
Get in there. We're feeling some just crazy energy. Whoa.
Ghost Adventures initially began as an independent film, produced in a documentary style. It was filmed in 2004 and released in 2006 on the Sci-Fi Channel. The film centered around Zach Baggins, Nick Groff, and Aaron Goodwin going to Virginia City, Nevada to investigate some ghosts. This was before 3 white dudes in their 30s could just make a podcast, so the group of guys would just go to famous ghost locations and just bully the dead until they got what they thought was a response.
Apologized the first time I came here in 2004.
Come and get me, ghost. Licking up slit my wrist just like you did.
I'm gonna admit I was a little out of line, and
The show is definitely known for the guys' over-the-top reactions, especially because these are just like 3 really buff, manly dudes, and they can never seem scared, so instead they just always have to act like really angry and possessed half the time. And their show always had the worst EVPs. Electronic voice phenomenon, if you're not familiar, is supposedly an audio that is being picked up of a ghost communicating, and typically it's not heard by the human ear or conveniently the cameras that are filming these shows. But Ghost Adventures in particular really just projects what these ghosts are saying.
Nick's digital recorder captured what sounds like a response to my request.
I call upon you to show yourself and show us your power.
But I was invested then and now to this day. So Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures were immediate successes, but why was that? So the answer to this question doesn't have one straightforward answer, but I think it's a combination of several things. In a 2019 IPSOS poll, 46% of respondents said they believed in ghosts. Chapman University also further suggested that 9% of Americans are actually afraid of ghosts. And the last Gallup study in 2005 suggested that 32% of Americans believed in ghosts, which was actually an increase from the previous study that was done in the 1990s. Although there's no one universal term for ghosts, it's defined incredibly culturally. I would say that many people in American culture anyways believe that ghosts are somehow related to the deaths of those who have passed on, either a residual energy or a person that is dead and trying to intelligently communicate with the living. Now, Americans as a society like to talk about death as much as Lin-Manuel Miranda likes to talk about Bruno. It's not a topic that gets a lot of deep conversation in your everyday life, and it can lead to some real dissonance. Oftentimes, hospice care can be viewed as giving up. Shockingly few Americans make plans for end-of-life care despite the high likelihood of need, especially when they're entering their geriatric years. When a person grieves, it is overwhelmingly private and within the bounds of the immediate family. And in this way, paranormal shows really can play off of this tension. It's a more marketable way to talk about a taboo topic that so many people feel like they can't come forward about. It's why we have to have such ungodly things as Crime Con. In some ways, it can be a comfort, the belief that death is not the end, that American life depicts it to be. In other ways, these shows play on that fear of the unknown, of death, of the loss of control. we don't know what happens at death, and we can't control what happens afterwards either. Hasbro made a similar video on the history of ghosts, and they mentioned this theory. I'll actually link their video. But many of the most popular ghost hunting shows go to places of national tragedy. Common sites include prisons, asylums, battlegrounds, or incidents of the most severe domestic violence in our nation's history. Just like death, Americans are quick to bury the past, but the grief of our past is still there, and maybe even in the form of a ghost. Seeing these sites and seeing these ghosts is a way of platforming our grief, speaking about it in an indirect enough way, but acknowledging that we can, in fact, be haunted, whether by ghosts or by emotions that we haven't fully processed as a nation. What is noticeably absent from a lot of these shows is the obvious genocides of Native Americans. Despite the overwhelming tragedy of their deaths, most of these shows limit talks to Indigenous people to mysticism and cultural stereotypes. One show I actually discovered in my research that I'm happy to share with you is The Other Side. It's been airing since 2014, but it's new to me. It's the first show I've seen where paranormal investigators actually work with an Aboriginal elder to unpack ghost stories. Just thought I'd plug that. We'll talk more about the severe lack of diversity in a lot of ghost hunting media. Just put a pin in that, but this was a really great discovery, and I recommend it. Last year, the share of Americans who belonged to a religious congregation fell below 50% for the first time in more than 80 years, according to a Gallup poll released in March. And the percent of people claiming no religion nearly tripled from 1978 to 2018, according to a general social survey. As religious affiliation declined over 4 years, belief in the afterlife remained steady. In 1978, about 70% of those studied believed in the afterlife, and about 74% reported the same in 2018. Even though people are less likely to affiliate with religious institutions, there is still a need for spiritualism, and perhaps ghosts fill that gap. I mean, who among us didn't get really into witchcraft after deconstructing their Christian faith? Just me? Okay. And also because ghost media was also cheaply accessible as puff pieces in the news, movies, or ghost hunting shows, this became among the most accessible means of exploring spirituality without explicit religious ties. A lot of ghost hunting pulls from Catholicism, but it's not necessarily rooted in the same strict bounds that Catholicism have, and you'll also see some weird, often uncomfortable blends of hoodoo and indigenous practices and Buddhism, any sort of belief that they can blend together. And you're really not supposed to think about the rules too much in these shows. Although historic ghost hunters like the Warrens were closely attached to Catholicism, modern ghost hunting has sort of played spiritual telephone with the beliefs of angels and demons to combine it with the modern tech and skeptical approach of ghost hunting shows. Harvey Irwin defines belief in the paranormal as having the same parameters as every other form of belief. Like other types of belief, a paranormal belief will be either intuitive or reflective, will have cognitive, affective, and sometimes behavioral components, will be distinct from a value or simple statement of preference, will be relatively stable and thus somewhat resistant to the influence of counterargument, and will be dimensional, that is, marked by various degrees of endorsement between the poles of extreme skepticism and extreme gullibility. Although very few people would say that they 100% believe in ghosts, I think a large amount of people would also hesitate to say that there's no possibility that they exist at all, either. What's the word for not quite a Bugara and not quite a Shaniac, you know? Even so, ghost hunting shows use every tool in the book to sway emotional reactions that lend toward belief, knowing that most people fall into this spectrum somewhere. Most are filmed at night, in dangerous locations, a scary scenario even if ghosts aren't real, maybe not for the men on these shows, but certainly for the women who watch it. They'll also employ heavy audio to enhance the spooks. Most witnesses interviewed on these shows are also careful in their approach. They'll define themselves as a skeptic, they'll try to talk through all the rational explanations that they ruled out, try to make themselves seem as credible as possible. And I'm not trying to say that they're intentionally lying or being manipulative in their experience, but it certainly lends to a greater likelihood of belief with the audience. Another common technique across ghost hunting shows is the replay. Often when they catch a spooky happening, they'll replay the finding multiple times so that the audience themselves can come to their own conclusion as to what they think it is. We're not necessarily going to ghost hunters for the expertise the way you would have approached the Warrens or more historical ghost hunters. Ghost hunting shows place the audience member in on the action, so you can come to your own conclusions. And ultimately, it's an area where Occam's razor produces different results for different people. Is it a simpler explanation that the wind blew a door open, or is the simpler explanation that a ghost walked through? Traditionally, spiritualism was limited to mediums and private seances. These were mostly women, and a select few who were able to intuit the psychic energy that crossed over into our world. Between the 40s and 80s, we saw a shift to academia and Catholic affiliation with the rise of parapsychology as a scientific study. Even though it's largely not treated as credible today, there was growing interest in the time in a lot of different areas of science because we were discovering so much in this era. And so a lot of these theories overlap. The Warrens publicly relied on electromagnetic theory and different sort of scientific methods to incorporate into their Catholic beliefs as a way of explaining their ghostly encounters in a more digestible way to skeptics anyways. Now, ghost hunter todays aren't reading the latest parapsychological experiment. They're urban exploring with their own spirit box and EMF detector. Although there's been decades of research dedicated to finding ghosts, and I very much believe in them myself, no study unequivocally proves that they exist. Nevertheless, several studies and developments in technology have led to the preeminence of tech in ghost hunting. In the new edition of Green's classic Ghost Hunting: A Practical Guide, it is said, "It should be remembered that the role of equipment is not to detect ghosts. There are currently no ghost-detecting devices in existence, but to attempt to record tangible and measurable evidence by way of instrumentation that may provide some corroboration as to what witnesses have already reported or provide some insight on the nature of the experience, for example, to see if a natural cause may be identified." So just because they observe differences in temperature or in electromagnetic frequencies, that doesn't mean that there's a ghost there. So it could be that people are actually being affected by electromagnetic changes and attaching their own cultural experiences to develop an explanation, in this case, ghosts. Or it could also be that some people are able to better pick up on electromagnetic field changes in the environment. But is the ghost making that change then? I don't know. Persinger developed what was called a haunt box. It's a special chamber which supposedly isolated and then bombarded the test subject with a very specific frequency of EMF. What his study found was that over 80% of the 1,000+ visitors had felt a presence when certain electromagnetic pulses are applied to their temporal lobes. So could a ghost be presenting these exact same symptoms in different contexts? Or is it the reverse? Are the hauntings really just being attributed to changes in EMF from something natural that we don't quite understand yet? The study doesn't really give us an answer to that. The reason you see so much research dedicated to EMFs is that they take the spiritualism of ghost hunting and gives it a more clinical approach, and arguably a more marketable approach to the previously untouched demographics of spiritualism. Spiritualism was historically very much tied to feminine energy, and this clinical reliance on scientific data was a better way to package these things to people with man brains, apparently. It's less focused on the feelings and energies that women of the past could sense, and more on the manly pursuit of truth-finding. Zach Baggins himself at the beginning of every episode will say that he is searching for the truth. See, the goal of most ghost hunting shows isn't to find peace for the spirits or to make an emotional revelation. It's for these specific hosts and the audience to gain some sort of knowledge over other people. It's to know the truth. It's both personal and universal all at the same time. And if not, it remains unsolved. Yes, this and capitalism really do have to come up in every single video, don't they? Ghost shows are overwhelmingly produced, written, and starring white men. Countless articles have been dedicated to the hypermasculinity and toxic traits of some of these shows, and particularly Zach Baggins.
It seems like the bigger, more macho, aggressive men is the ones that get more handled.
Like Zach?
Yeah.
Particularly earlier in the seasons when he would continually antagonize the ghost, embrace gender even in the great beyond.
Are you a male or a female spirit? Once for a male, twice for a female. Stop it. Stop. Stop.
I swear, if I still have to deal with my gender identity in the afterlife, I am going to lose it. I refuse to be a spooky lady in white, okay? Just let me be a tree. Everyone likes trees. I mentioned before, despite paranormal and occult practices being historically feminine, attempts to include women, or God forbid, a person of color, have been incredibly difficult to say the least. Lorraine Warren is perhaps the most notable exception from the early years. Her and her husband sort of perfectly display the dichotomy of modern ghost media. Ed is the muscle of the operation. He's the demonologist, the person who's putting all the historical pieces together, whereas Lorraine is supposed to be the empathetic and communicative one who really intuits how the spirits are feeling in any particular situation. And a lot of ghost shows in the early 2000s that did feature women would put them in this role. You know, they'd play a medium, except this time there would be about 3 or 4 Eds to the one Lorraine to really ratio those demons. One sad example of a break in this trend is the girly ghost hunters. Now, despite the name, this short-lived show was run, written, produced entirely by men, other than the 4 leads. A man takes them around wherever they need to go. The men are following them around with their cameras. Well, the women all seem competent enough when they're interviewing people and looking into the history. As soon as the light goes out, it is just like a wild, incoherent screaming fest.
I'm not going down.
Go.
I feel like I'm
Go.
It's like swimming.
Are you guys going down?
Yes, come on.
Come on.
No, I'm not going down.
Get in here, Nicole. Touch the end and go. Come on. Come on.
No. Oh my god, that's a freaking bat.
I'm not going back.
Now again, I love BuzzFeed Unsolved. Maybe these women would have developed like Ryan in later seasons and been less prone to screaming because their show was cut short after 1 season. But it definitely seems like the show, the premise of the show, what's meant to keep you watching is just like watching women be terrorized. And like, I already walk to the parking garage at night after my classes. Like, I can experience a woman in terror whenever I want. I don't need this simulated on television for me anymore. Thank you.
What was that? Sounds like ducks.
Ducks? Ducks?
I don't know.
Another short-lived show that was actually really good was The Ghost Brothers. This show follows 3 black men based in Atlanta as they explore different haunted locations and take the BuzzFeed Unsolved approach of not taking itself too seriously. One of the leads, Dalen Spratt, is given all the info about a particular haunted location, but he initially doesn't enter the space. Instead, he remotely guides his 2 friends, fellow hunters Juwan Moss and Marcus Harvey, into the spaces with no knowledge about the potential spirits that they might be walking into. Now, notably, none of them were paranormal experts. They simply started the show because they noticed that there was a serious lack of diversity and they wanted to fill some of that space. And it looks like they actually just released a new spin-off on Discovery Plus, so good for them. Another YouTube channel that unfortunately is no longer active anymore, I think, is the Queer Ghost Hunters, which, as you might have guessed, features queer ghost hunters and queer ghosts. As I mentioned before, despite some of the most horrific instances of violence and oppression in our country, in prisons, hospitals, battlegrounds, everywhere, was largely and disproportionately done to people of color, queer people, mentally ill people, disabled people, the stories that rarely get any sort of focus. Oftentimes the stories that linger in popular culture are the stories that trigger popular culture's own anxieties, which, given that most of these shows are run by and starring men, I find it interesting that you happen to see so many scorned women in white dresses, or La Llorona types who are seeking out revenge to the men who harmed them. I mean, just look at the pilot of Supernatural. Like, the ghosts that haunt white men are the people who are going to give back the shit they give to living women. And it's like, people of color, queer people have to worry about the living white dudes, and these ghosts on top of that. Trigger warning, Shane Dawson alert. I think a perfect example of how ghosts are shaped by our anxiety is the comeback video of Shane Dawson. If you don't know, Shane Dawson was exposed in 2020 for a lengthy history of racist, misogynistic, just like shameful behavior. And his epic comeback that made the YouTube trending was Shane exploring the site of a historic indigenous genocide. Well, at least like 30 minutes of it was. A lot of it was about him and his mansion. And, you know, I could critique the ghost hunting, that it's bad, that all they really do is just say, oh, spooky road, and nothing really happens. But if we look at these aforementioned theories, going back to sites of shame, of grief, I just do find it interesting that Shane chose a site of indigenous genocide, especially when he was coming back from a racist scandal. I'm trying to think how Shane Dawson would think, which I don't know is that's a task I can accomplish. But I wonder if maybe he hoped that by showing the ghosts at the indigenous site that he would feel either some forgiveness from the ghosts themselves or from people watching. I mean, he is an empath after all. Or maybe like the most scary place to be to him is with a group of indigenous people who were seriously harmed for years on end by some white dude who does this. And here's a man who platformed himself on belittling cultural identities for a living. Yeah, I think those ghosts would be out for Shane Dawson too. So while ghost hunting media definitely has its fair share of problems, and not all ghost hunting shows are created equal, I still fully love ghosts and ghost hunting shows. I don't know, I just think that feeling of experiencing the paranormal and having other people experience it well is just fascinating and validating, and there's just like so many layers to unpack. Because of that, for all the people who have stuck around until this point, I wanted to share my own ghost story with you right now. I've dealt with sleep paralysis really as long as I can remember. I've never been a good sleeper. And when I was younger, I didn't know what sleep paralysis was when I was like 6 or 7, right? So my mind immediately went to, I'm seeing a ghost when I wake up in the night, and I would just see shadow figures over my bed or see things floating around. And because I would typically see like the same things in my sleep paralysis, like it was always sort of the same pattern, it was pretty easy to parse it out once I like woke up enough to like process what was happening. Back in high school, I would sleep every night with our family dog, Nutmeg. Just like any other night, Nutmeg and I had gone to sleep, and I woke up at about like 2 or 3 in the morning to like a weird clicking sound. And it wasn't like a sleep paralysis froze, like I froze like from fear. Just kind of listening, and I couldn't figure out what I was hearing. And so, like I said, it took me a couple seconds to sort of realize that I'm awake. And so I'm like, okay, well, this must be my sleep paralysis, because even though I don't normally have like noise paralysis, that's probably what this is. And so I try to just like kind of close my eyes and pretend that I'm not hearing it. But it keeps going. And then I hear growl from the end of the bed. And I look over, and Nutmeg is just like, she's doing that thing that like pointer dogs do. Her body is just like stretched out, and you can see all the hair sort of curled up on her back. And she is standing on the edge of the bed, staring on top of my dresser. And that's when I realized what the sound I'm hearing is. Maybe a year before, I had gotten a typewriter from a friend. I think it was originally his grandmother's, and I said that I couldn't possibly accept it, and he was like, I have a bunch of this stuff laying around in the house, like, just take it. Like, but I didn't ask too many questions because it's a free typewriter. So that moment when I realized that, like, Nutmeg is also hearing what I'm hearing is when it, like, gets really freaky for me. Because at this point, I'm fully awake. I am not dreaming. I know what I'm seeing. I'm seeing Nutmeg growling, and it's too dark to see over to the typewriter. All I can hear is the noise. Again, maybe this was sleep paralysis, but eventually I just like fell asleep, and I felt really like weird the next day. Obviously, I was freaked out. And so then, just outside of my room, we had like a little living space with a couch, a TV, and behind the couch, what would be back here, was just like a wall of different family pictures, right? And so I'm just sitting watching TV, and I hear a picture frame fall down. And so I turn around, and I look and see a frame on the ground. And since it's fallen face down, obviously I can't see which one it is. But I go to pick it up, and it's a picture of me. And it's the one picture of me that does not have any of my other family members up on this entire wall. And to me, that just came across as validation from the ghost of like, I know you heard me, like, yeah, it was me. I didn't necessarily feel like threatened by any of that. And interestingly, like, my paranormal experiences like really chilled out once I got out of that house, got into college. But, you know, I can also attribute that to a lot of stress that was going on in my life in high school. But yeah, that is one of my spooky stories. And again, I really would love if everyone would share their spooky stories below. And just like let me know what you thought of ghost hunting shows. If there are any good ghost hunting shows I need to be watching now that I missed in the past, I am all ears. So if you like this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, because I will be posting more videos if I feel like it.